official debate happening. We have Firtox here. We have Deonteleologist. For this debate, Firtox is taking the proposition that races and humans exist and largely match haplogroups. Deonteleologist is taking the opposition. As always, we're going to be based upon who concedes. If we don't hear a vocal concession, we'll put it to a voting poll in which you, the audience, can decide on who you think won the debate. The debate will have a time limit of, I believe, 35 minutes now, and it'll have
40. We can still do 45. We can just do it to 3 minutes after.
Okay, that's fine. Then we'll go with a 45-minute time limit for the debate, and it will have medium moderation. And also, aside from me stepping in during the times of a medium moderation debate, if any of you feel like you need a moderator to jump in, just call for me and I'll jump right in and handle the situation. Okay, thank you both for debating. You can get started.
Okay, so I guess the first thing is to define race. I'm using race very loosely in this term. And kind of just the general public perception of what a race is. The kind of form you fill them, or perhaps in a hospital or in the medical field, they'll have different races. And I'm using it in that sort of way. Would you agree to this?
I mean, you can tell me that you're going to use it however you want to use it. But you just telling me that you're using it in a general sense doesn't help a lot, because there are a lot of different general senses in which the term is.
Just the sort of thing that in the medical field, or perhaps in the educational field, where you have to tick a box or write down your ethnicity or race, I'm using it in that sort of way.
Well, there is a big difference, because if you're asked to write down your ethnicity, you're typically going to give at least, the majority of people that I know in the US, if asked their ethnicity, would sort of rattle off a list or give like a math equation. I'm 50% German, 12.5% Scottish, blah, 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 whatever. That's typically how people would respond if you asked their ethnicity. But if you ask their race, my experience has been that people there's a much smaller pool of possible identities, such as Caucasian, Hispanic, Black, Asian, Latino, right?
Right. For example, in India, there are some people who would be considered Caucasoid in genetics.
Right. So let's get clear on whether we're asking about race, as we just touched on, or ethnicity, because that's going to be important. So are we sticking with race?
I guess the main reason I made this is kind of because of the whole recent upsurgence of race as a social construct, or whatever. I'm just arguing against that kind of popular kind of denial of differences between groups based on genetic factors.
Okay, before we get there though, let's get very precise about what is meant by race. So can you give me do you have an exhaustive list of the races?
I mean, I'm gonna first I'll come back to that, but at first I'll jump to haplogroups, so we kind of get a more idea of perhaps what kind of in terms of what the genetic research says about this kind of thing. And it's basically clusters of different things, and some clusters are closer to each other. So if you look at the differences in genetically between ethnicities or races, it'll be, for example, 50% of either being how genes are coded, right?
I really need to clarify something, because you said we'll come back to races. Let me get to haplogroups first. But when you're talking about haplogroups, now you're bringing up race again, and I don't know what you mean.
Okay, so when you look at somebody and then you say, okay, this person is maybe not you in particular, but I'm saying in general, when people look at somebody and kind of say this person is African, or this person is a pygmy, or this person is Aboriginal, or this person is Polynesian, or this person is Maori. I'm talking in terms of those sort of phenotypical groups, sort of thing.
But I mean, there are many ways that you could do it. I mean, you just gave several different identity labels based on phenotypes, but many of those were not at sort of the same level of generality. So you said African, but you also said pygmy. You said, so there are all, I mean, I could organize people religiously by phenotype if they were wearing enough clothing associated with their religion. I could say, oh, this person's Muslim, or this person is Sikh, right? That doesn't mean that it's a race. So I mean, you are going to need to be more specific.
I'm sort of saying that if there is enough of a need, if it is useful in some way to differentiate between these groups, then you should differentiate these groups. So I'm sort of saying,
yeah, but which groups? I need to know which groups are races versus which groups are nationalities or ethnic groups or religious groups or pseudo categories.
I'm not American, so I think part of the conflict here is the cultural clash, I guess. I'm from New Zealand, but for the I'm just trying to figure out, not figure out. I'm trying to define races basically. If there is enough of a need or of a reason, if it is useful to separate these different peoples into different groups, then you could kind of, if there's some sort of usefulness and need, and that there are differences in these groups, then you should separate them.
That's very I don't know whether it's exactly circular, but it strikes me as at the very least ad hoc, because you're saying, how are we going to define races? Well, races we distinguish races based on whether it's useful to distinguish them, and then the conclusion sort of ends up being it's useful to distinguish races. So you sort of seem to be presupposing something. I need to just know what sorts.
I'm using this kind of like, have you heard of? Do you know how they differentiate subspecies or species in animals?
Please tell me.
I'm not an expert on this by any means, but from what little I've looked into this, they just look at at least historically, look at the differences between different organisms and the groups of them, and if there's a large enough variation between them, then they'll classify them as either a subspecies or species. And
Okay,
yeah,
so
it's not like a straight line. It's kind of a bit blurry as well.
I mean, just to be clear, is this an analogy, or are you saying that races are subspecies?
No, I'm not making the contention that races are subspecies. I'm saying that it is kind of comparable to subspecies, and that's the closest we can find. It is either all breeds of dogs or subspecies, however you want to talk about it.
Okay, so just to like sort of recap where we've gone a little bit, you started out by saying you just mean something sort of intuitive, or you're working with like a sort of common sense understanding of races, something that you might see, whether say you're like checking a box on the US Census, or when you're applying to a university, or when you're in the hospital or something. But when you gave me your examples, well, first you said you sort of switched it up a little and said, we're going to make these distinctions, racial distinctions, insofar as they're useful. And presumably you might think that there are more useful distinctions to be made than are posited by the common sense conception of race. So that would be another way in which your conception is distinguished from the common sense conception of race. But again, I need like a sort of set of what these racial groups are, because I mean the classical conception, Carl Linnaeus, right, when he invented the concept of race, he was a scientist, and he thought that there were, you know, the reds, the yellows, the blacks, and the whites. I want to know, like, what's your version of that?
I think from the point of view that I'm coming from, it's not quite important where exactly we separate them, or we know exactly how many groups there are to be able to determine whether there are races. I'm just trying to say that races that do exist, as in there are different groups of people that we can differentiate.
I mean, we can differentiate all sorts of different groups of people, right? We can differentiate the Lakers fans from the Clippers fans in the city of Los Angeles. We can differentiate people for all sorts of reasons. But if you're trying to convince me of the claim that races exist, I need to know what you mean by races and what your core examples are.
For example,
Okay.
okay, perhaps. Because when I think of race, I kind of mix in between race and ethnicity. I kind of think of race and ethnicity as kind of variants of each other, so to speak. Because if you look at gene clusters, there's this larger gene group, and then in the middle of them, there's you can also separate them further.
Okay.
Like you can say African, but then in that you can break it into Bantu, and further that you can break that further down. So it's not just like one sort of this is a race and it is based on this criteria, so to speak. They're just clusters and different size clusters, and they it's not just this A, B, and C and D race. That's not my view of race.
How many races do you think that there probably are? If you give a rough estimate.
Sort of the races, like, do you think Bantu is a race, or do you think African is a race, or do you want to break it up further?
I don't think that either of those are race, because my conception of race is that African is, well, that refers to a continent of people who live on a continent. Bantu would probably be an ethnic group. My understanding of race is that it refers to groups like Black, white, Asian, very big, broad, general categories. That's my understanding of what the common sense conception of race is, you know, having grown up in the US my whole life. Like when we talk about racial issues in the US, what is the typical dynamic? It's like white on black racism, right? It's not it's not, say, like you know, German on Bantu racism or something like that.
See, I see where you're saying. In America, they differentiate themselves or discriminate based on these wider, more broader, more slightly more nebulous terminologies rather than the specific ethnicities or more clean cut, so to speak, groups. Is that kind of what you're saying?
I'm saying, yeah, that's what that the history of like racism in the U.S. has been largely dominated by discrimination based on these much broader categories. Of course, if you go back far enough, there was discrimination of certain white or European ethnic minorities like the Irish, the Italians, and so on. Whether it exactly would be correct to call that like racism, I think the reason that rubs a lot of people the wrong way is because that's like because Italian isn't a race and Irish isn't a race in the conception that Americans typically understand it as.
Right, right.
But I mean, like, if you want to argue that, like, that ethnic groups exist, I don't think anyone's going to deny that ethnic groups exist.
We can go with the prior kind of like the American conception of race. I'm fine with that. Of like, what are the big groups in America? White, Black, Hispanic, Native American, Asian,
Right.
that kind of thing.
Hispanic is a bad term because it literally just means it refers to people who have their origins in Spanish-speaking countries. So it includes like both Spaniards and like Uruguayans. But so I would say something instead like Latinos, Asians, Middle Eastern people, or like Arabs. So I think Arab also has like cultural and linguistic connotations. So something like Middle Eastern, Black, White, Latino, Native, or Indigenous. And yeah, maybe there are a few more, but like, yeah, these like big cluster groups.
All right, sure. That's fine. We can define it that way. If no problem with that.
So this is what we're working with.
Yeah. That's good.
Right. So then I guess it's on you to tie them to haplogroups.
Okay. So let's start with my first kind of claim that races in humans exist. And I'm saying that because, well, these groups have disparate. You can separate them on many categories. You can look at the different rates of diseases. You can look at the different life outcomes. These groups all differ from each other in uncountable but also measurable ways. We can go with the medical field, for example. I believe that blacks might have a high rate of heart disease, for example. I'm not a medical professional. I don't do that much research into physiology of medicine or whatever. But I believe that I know for sure that these different groups contract different diseases and have different disorders at different rates. Do you contend with that?
I mean, I haven't looked at the data myself. I would imagine it's entirely plausible that there are, on average, racial differences in certain vulnerabilities to certain diseases, or I mean, all sorts of medical issues.
Yeah,
but
like sickle cell, for example. I think that's a classic example.
I mean, I don't know a whole lot about it, but I don't understand how these correlations between or these average statistical averages on applied to racial groups is evidence of like biologically distinct races, because it seems entirely possible that the disparities or the statistical averages of certain medical issues can be explained tied to ethnicity and environment and these averages, right? If a group has been in one geographic location for thousands of years, and then now we live in this like globalized society, and we see that, oh look, like actually, in Black people in the U.S. are more likely than white people in the U.S. to get sickle cell, but also Black people in Jamaica or in South Africa are more likely to get sickle cell than the white people there. That doesn't mean that Black people are biologically distinct as a race. Like there are all sorts of potential evolutionary and genetic explanations that would be tied to ethnicity rather than race.
Okay, what's the difference between ethnicity and race? And what do you?
Well, I mean, as we're understanding it here, there are multiple ethnic groups that make up a race, right? Because we're using races in this very broad sense, right? Like Asian is a race. There are a whole huge number of different ethnic groups that make up that race. Same with like white or Caucasian, right? You have Belgians, Italians, Finnish people, Scottish people, German people, blah, blah, blah. And when it comes to Black people, there is an incredible amount of ethnic diversity in the different African ethnic groups. So, yeah, there would be a huge number of ethnic groups making up a race. And this race, the way that we like sort of carve out the distinction between races is social, because these like there's, right, like for instance, Ashkenazi Jewish women are more likely to get a certain kind of breast cancer, right? They're like far more likely to get a certain kind of breast cancer than like anyone else. And these women are white.
I think Jew and white are probably different different races. I might posit
that. I mean, you could argue that, but like, if you looked at my girlfriend, who's an Ashkenazi Jew, I mean, she like her mom is full Ashkenazi Jewish. Her father is 100% Irish, and she looks Irish, with like, a slightly Ashkenazi Jewish nose, and yet she is at risk for the gene of the Ashkenazi Jewish women that would give them breast cancer. Anyone passing by my girlfriend on the street would undoubtedly call her a white woman because she is one. But
someone could mistake a pygmy for an Aboriginal, but those are extremely. Someone might not even know that there is such a population as pygmy or Aboriginal, and they could call both of them Indian, for example. I'm just bringing up a random example, but that doesn't mean that they're Indian. Even if most people might think that they are, yeah.
It doesn't mean that they're Indian, yeah. But I mean, if we're going with the common sense conception of race, as is operational in the United States, I mean, the only people who don't think that Ashkenazi Jewish people are white in terms of what their race is are like KKK members and neo-Nazis.
I haven't looked at the gene mappings of Ashkenazi Jews versus the gene mapping on white, so I wouldn't be able to answer that question, but I'm not arguing that the current conception of races and the delineation between them, and the number of races in the US are exactly mapping to if we made a genetic models, for example, or life outcomes or anything, by any empirical measurement. I'm not saying they match them exactly. I'm just saying that these are groups and that they're not arbitrary kind of just slapped on just because they're in the same geographical region.
Yeah, I'm just having trouble getting like what the motivation is for believing in these races, because I mean, you pointed out there's sort of racial disparities in terms of Black people are more likely to get this disease. I mean, it's a serious question whether all Black people of every ethnic group are equally predisposed or are even predisposed at all.
Yeah, it's probably not. That's probably not true.
Right. So if it's not, then it seems to me that it's a matter of ethnicity, where like there are genetic differences between ethnic groups. No, I mean, I don't know anyone who's going to deny that. But you're arguing for a biological or genetic distinction between races over and above ethnic groups.
No. I'm not arguing for over and above ethnic groups. I never said that. Did I imply that? Did you believe that implied that?
So I mean, maybe this was just a semantic error on my part when I said over and above. I mean, you're saying not only that there are ethnic groups, genetically or biologically, there are also racial, biological, or genetic groups.
Okay, I'll have to get into more exact science. I'm saying that in clusters there are kind of more clusters. If you look at companies or different species, we have primates and then we have like monkeys and apes, and you can separate it further. I'm saying that for a company, there's an umbrella company, and this company owns this and that and that. For example, like the Coca-Cola company or any huge conglomerate, you'd be able to kind of umbrella them out. That's kind of more what I'm getting at. There aren't these ethnicities aren't just isolated, and they're not just as different from one another, from one ethnicity as every other.
You're gonna have to spell out that analogy for me a little bit more. I'm not clear on how that's supposed to work.
Okay, maybe perhaps I can post a photo or a link.
Also, remember, we only got like 20 more minutes.
Okay.
I guess, I mean, one question to pose is, what is the value in positing these biological or genetic entities racial groups, what is the value in it when it seems pretty clear to me that all of the work that you could want it to do can be done by ethnicity.
And that's probably true from like a forensic medical perspective, but people do separate themselves along racial lines. And also you can't measure every person's genes. It's extremely resource intensive to find out every person's ethnicity. And if you just have a questionnaire, you can garner much of the kind of information or value from knowing someone's ethnicity by just having a simple questionnaire of race.
Well, you can garner their ethnicity from having a questionnaire of race?
No, I'm saying that the benefits of knowing someone's ethnicity are also imparted. Like much of the benefits of knowing that are also, or the information from knowing that is also garnered by just having the information on somebody's race.
I mean, I think that pretty clearly, in my view, the Ashkenazi Jew example is a counterexample there, because if you go to the doctor and they want you to check your race, Ashkenazi Jew is not going to show up among those boxes. And the one that's you're likely, if you're an Ashkenazi Jew, as one of my moms is, and she's pretty obviously white, she's going to select Caucasian or white, and she's going to, if she's concerned about the gene for breast cancer, then she's going to have to bring that up with her doctor on her own. Her doctor's knowing what race she is not helping whatsoever.
And then I mean that it's not separated enough. It's not. I don't believe that the current pop culture kind of view of the races is completely scientifically accurate or empirically accurate or accurate from a social science standpoint. These things are malleable. They're changeable. It's just based on public opinion. A lot of it.
So races exist, but they are socially relative or constructed or malleable?
No. If they are gene groups, people don't separate these different racial groups directly based on gene mapping or gene clusters. They do it based on behavior and personality, and also what someone looks like.
I think they largely. I think they largely do it based on physical characteristics.
Yes,
it's interesting that you would put behavior first.
I say behavior first because we were just talking about that Ashkenazis are under the umbrella of whites.
Yeah, because of how they behave?
No, because of how they look, and that's why they are under the same umbrella.
Okay.
But you can measure, for example, some other psychometric tests, and Ashkenazis perhaps would score higher than white Europeans on some tests, or perhaps low on some tests. And that there are other tests you can do, empirical tests that aren't just, for example, the breast cancer example you cited, that would be able to separate them further.
Okay, but earlier about a minute ago, you said something about the idea of race and not being very empirically accurate and being malleable. Could you explain a little bit of them?
Okay, I'm saying that when the average person thinks in their head of a certain race, they don't look at gene clusters or different researchers on the differences between races. They don't look at these empirical factors. They just look at this person looks like this, and this group of people generally looks like this. So in my mind, I will be under the conception that if a person is like this, or looks like this, or behaves like this, they belong to this certain race or ethnicity or whatever. Okay. They don't base it on scientific research. Is kind of what I'm saying, and so it's not completely accurate. and often it will not be completely accurate due to that.
Right, but your conclusion that you're trying to argue for is that races exist, and we're allowing ourselves to operate with this, as you admit, flawed conception of races.
Not because of the idea of there being different races, but because the way we differentiate races may not be completely scientifically or empirically accurate.
So then, so where's the argument, or what's the reasoning or evidence for there being a scientifically accurate way of understanding or conceptualizing race?
Okay, because again, I think a lot of the examples that I would cite, you would just say that these aren't useful if you have somebody's ethnicity. You'd probably say that someone's ethnicity is more important or should be taken, or you would say that if you know somebody's ethnicity or what their race is it's kind of null, it's kind of irrelevant. But what I'm trying to say is that people separate themselves often based on not their ethnicity, or not just their ethnicity, but they base it on their race. Like people self-segregate based on their race. People form groups or friend groups with people that are more similar to them, and one of the main characteristics that they do this by is by their race or by their ethnicity. People who are genetically similar to them.
It sounds to me like you're endorsing a straightforwardly social constructivist idea of what race is.
No, not at all. I'm just saying that I'm just describing the way that people self-segregate. And if you were to say that people self-segregating themselves based on these characteristics is a social construction, then sure. But it doesn't. I'm not worried about the semantics, the term that we describe it as. I'm just trying to say that there are real world impact of somebody's race, so to speak, that are just that are imposed upon them, that they choose for themselves, and not because their society chose them to do such. It's kind of like natural.
It's natural to have a conception of race, the sort of conception we have now.
Well, I'm not exactly sure what you mean with the sort of conception we have now, but I mean, when babies and lots of different animals have a conception of different groups of humans as being separate from one another, like this human looks like this, and this group of human that looks like this.
Is there evidence that that they make racial distinctions naturally? I don't know how you could possibly like test that when by the time these sorts of distinctions are going to be made by a human being, they've already undergone so much socialization that I don't know how you could ever try to isolate pure nature.
People prefer to spend time with those that are similar to them, and race is one way, or one aspect, or the genetic similarity is one aspect that they choose to distinguish or differentiate themselves by.
I mean, if race, right, understood in this broad phenotypical sense, right, race can't explain something like the Rwandan genocide at all, because to an outsider looking at these two different ethnic groups, they are the exact same race. They're black. The genocide was prompted by ethnic tensions and hatred based on ethnic distinctions. So to argue that like you naturally have like a conception of race, it would seem strange then for there to be any conflict on the African continent at all, unless it's non-Africans coming in.
I'm not making like the claim that the majority of conflict or all conflict is based on race. I'm saying that people choose to spend time with other people that are similar to them, and that one of the ways that they do this is by people who look and act like them.
Okay,
There's probably
but
like a lot of studies that you can bring up that people who are friends with each other are genetically similar. I can bring up a study, like we don't have that much time, so I will take valuable time out of my debate to do this right now. But
right.
people choose to spend time with each other, with other people that are similar.
Okay. What I just want to ask though is, when I asked you, like, what is the value of positing these biological or genetic conceptions of race, right, in addition to ethnicity, your answer was, even though it's true that in these medical studies, all you really need is ethnicity, and knowing a person's race isn't going to help. It's still true that people see race as important.
Yeah,
And
race is important
if
to
that's
people,
your argument, I
and it's
I
the thing.
don't see how you could possibly get around it being a social constructivist view, because the biology is in the ethnic groups, is in the ethnicity. But
This is where we go to haplogroups. So there's this, let's say that black is one big cluster, and this big cluster, if you zoom into it, there are smaller clusters, and perhaps in these smaller clusters, there are more clusters. And these smaller clusters are the ethnicity, and this big cluster is the race. So just because there is the existence of these smaller clusters doesn't mean the bigger cluster that envelops all of them is irrelevant.
but my challenge that I had posed to you was, what is the genetic or medical or biological benefit of positing distinctions between racial groups, not just ethnic groups? And your answer was not at all based on biology or anything scientific. It was based on human social interactions.
That can be scientific. We look at what different subspecies and different species relate to, at least in the past, based on how they interact with one another.
So yes,
So from a biological
I'm not denying
standpoint,
that there are social sciences, right? They're from a scientific perspective, from like a sociological perspective, or a political science perspective, there is scientific analysis that we can do with respect to the concept of race and how racial groups interact. But your whole argument, as far as I understand, was in an effort to debunk the idea that race is a socially constructed identity category. But
yeah.
but all I'm hearing from you is that the evidence for all the biological and medical and genetic evidence for disparate groups phenotypically and also genetically, right? This is all a matter of ethnic groups. It's all a matter of ethnicity. And when I asked you, okay, so then what's the point of adding race into the picture? You still haven't given me anything more than a social answer. And that's my view, is that
I
race
want to
is.
go to the haplogroup. If you look at haplogroups, as I said before, the big cluster is the race, and individually the small cluster is ethnicity. It's, for example, it's saying that it's not all that useful to know what umbrella company a product is coming from. All you need to really know is the individual smaller companies that are owned by them.
So just to be clear, I mean, I don't want people listening to get really like sidetracked here at the end, because we didn't talk much about haplogroups, but all the research that I did on haplogroups haplogroups were not racial categories. These were very clearly
Yeah.
small ethnic groups.
These small ethnic groups, if you zoom out, they have more similarities or very closely match to other ethnicities that we would consider to be under the same racial category than ones that we would consider to be separate.
So, I mean, I think it is. I mean, I don't want to be disparaging here, but there are like 3 or 4 times when I asked you, look, where you conceded that ethnicity is all you need to get the genetic useful information. You conceded like 3 or 4 times that point, and then you said something about why race was also useful. And now, with 1 minute left in the debate, you're saying, no, haplogroups give this genetic basis to our positing the independent existence of races.
I don't know whether independent existence is the right term. I'm saying that these clusters, if you group them up, for example, if you look at a family, right? A family, you could argue that there is a small microcosm of an ethnicity. And if you look at the broader, like a wider family tree, you could say that that could be a race. This is, I'm just using this kind of comparison to say, so it's not just a matter of, it's, of course, you're from this family, you have this mother and father, but it's also kind of can be relevant or important to know your genetic ancestry, or if you climb back up further up the tree.
Not. I'd like to go to closing statements.
Okay.
Yes,
Cool.
go. Yeah.
So, do you want to start, Deon?
Sure. I mean, I don't have much to say. I feel like I just gave a pretty succinct summary of the loops that I felt like we were going in for the last 20 to 30 minutes of the debate. It seemed to me that up until I actually said the words social constructivist conceptualization of race, that Firtox was in complete agreement with me. And I think pretty much when he got to those points and said and conceded that, look, yeah, ethnicity, these are the things, ethnic differences between populations, track certain interesting and valuable medical, genetic, blah, 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 differences between populations. And then I asked, okay, so what's the value of the race? And then each time it was something like people choose to have these categories. They're meaningful in our social lives. And it was never really a genetic or biological basis to the race category. And that is my view, is that, and I don't deny that race is very significant in the world we live in today, and that it's been extremely significant in shaping the world that we now inhabit throughout the past, say, 400 years. But I do think that at the end of the day, that's what race is. It's a social construction. It is based largely on observable differences between clusters of ethnic groups, but I see no biological or genetic basis or value in the concept of race. I feel like I've said my piece.
Okay. Well, my argument was more that races exist, and you could define a race as kind of like a broader cluster of clusters of genes, so to speak. So you could say that a race is basically a cluster of these genes that are a branch, this branch of human species, and then this kind of these different ethnicities, so to speak, could be the small branches, and then the leaves could be the wider families in them. That just because that these smaller branches do exist does not deny the existence of these wider, larger, bigger clusters of races. Just because ethnicities exist does not deny that existence, which is my argument that they do exist. They have a genetic basis, and
It's a glitch.
Okay, I kind of lost my train of thought, but saying that the existence of ethnicities basically does not deny the existence of race. They exist in the same way that ethnicities exist. They exist.
Okay, all set?
Yeah, that's it.
Great. Well, thank you both for debating, and thank you both for having a very cordial debate, even though it was a moderated debate. I actually didn't have to speak up once, so thank you both for being very cordial.
Yeah, thanks Firtox. It was very, very respectful. Well done.